It's been a few weeks since I've had any contact with the outside world. I'm not even sure how or where to begin explaining everything that's happened. It feels strange to say it out loud or to write it, even here. But if I don't get this down somewhere, I'm afraid no one will know what happened to me. Maybe someone out there will read this. Maybe they'll take it seriously. And maybe they'll never come to a place like this. My story begins last month. I was stuck in a dead-end job, drowning in bills, and desperate to get out of the city. That's when I saw a job posting for a teaching position in a remote village, great pay, full room and board, and a chance to escape the chaos. I applied without thinking twice, and within a week, I got an email saying I'd been accepted. The job description was vague. They just needed someone to teach basic English to a small group of children in a place called Kilburn Hollow. I'd never heard of it before, and when I tried searching for it online, nothing came up. I figured it was just a small, secluded village in the middle of nowhere, and that's what I was looking for anyway. I packed my things and took the long bus ride out. The route was winding and desolate, cutting through thick forests and mountains. I was the only passenger for miles, and every time the bus slowed down, I felt this creeping unease, like something was watching me from the trees. Finally, as dusk began to settle, the bus pulled up to a small, unmarked road. The driver turned to me, his expression serious, almost warning me. "This is where you get off," he said. His voice low. "Kilburn Hollow's just down that path. But be careful, miss." Before I could ask what he meant, the doors closed, and the bus disappeared down the road, leaving me alone. The path leading into the village was narrow, flanked by towering trees that blocked out the last rays of sunlight. It was unnervingly quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, heavy silence. I walked for what felt like hours before I saw the first house. Kilburn Hollow looked like something frozen in time. The houses were old, made of dark, weathered wood, with roofs that sagged under the weight of years. There were no cars, no streetlights, just rows of empty windows staring back at me as I walked down the main street. Eventually, I found the house where I was supposed to stay. A woman in her 60s greeted me at the door, her face pale and drawn. She introduced herself as Mrs. Hopkins, my host and the head of the village's school. She didn't say much, just showed me to my room. A small, dusty space with a single bed and a rickety desk. She handed me a candle and told me that electricity was scarce out here, so I'd need to use it sparingly. Before she left, she looked me in the eyes, her gaze dark and tired. "Keep your curtains closed at night," she said, "and whatever you do, don't leave the house after dark." I didn't question it at the time. I was exhausted from the journey and just wanted to sleep. But that night, as I lay in bed, I felt this strange sense of dread settle over me. It was irrational, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The first few days went smoothly enough. The children were quiet, almost eerily well behaved. They sat in silence, eyes wide and unblinking as I taught. They hardly spoke to each other and never smiled. Even when I tried to make the lessons fun, whenever I asked them about their lives or families, they would just look at me with that same blank expression. It was unsettling, to say the least. But I told myself it was just a cultural difference, or that they were shy around a new teacher. She was only on the fourth night that I began to realize something was very wrong in Kilburn Hollow. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, when I heard the sound of footsteps outside my window. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. I remembered Mrs. Hopkins's warning to keep the curtains closed, but curiosity got the best of me. I pulled the curtain back just a little, enough to peek outside. My heart froze. Standing in the middle of the street was a figure, tall and thin, wearing what looked like a long, black coat. I couldn't make out any details. Their face was hidden in shadow, but they were staring right at my window. I quickly let go of the curtain and backed away, my heart pounding. The footsteps continued for hours, circling the house, getting closer, then farther, then closer again. I barely slept that night, clutching the candle until dawn finally broke. The next morning, I tried to ask Mrs. Hopkins about it, but she just shook her head, muttering something about the watchers. She didn't elaborate, and when I pressed her, she only looked more fearful. That night, I heard the footsteps again. This time, there were more of them, several sets, all pacing around the house. I stayed up listening, terrified, unable to move. At one point, I heard scratching at the door, followed by a whisper, of voice so faint I couldn't make out the words, but it was insistent, pleading. The days turned into a blur of fear and exhaustion. I stopped eating, stopped sleeping, just went through the motions. The children noticed, but they didn't say anything. They just watched me with those blank, empty eyes. Then one evening, as I was leaving the school, a little girl approached me. She grabbed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong, and looked up at me with a fear I hadn't seen in any of the other children. "You have to leave," she whispered. "They don't like strangers here." Before I could ask her anything else, she ran off, disappearing down one of the narrow alleys. Her words haunted me for the rest of the night, echoing in my mind as I lay in bed, waiting for the footsteps. Around midnight, the noises started again, but this time they were louder, more insistent. The footsteps were closer, faster, almost frantic. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A knock at my door. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks. I held my breath, hoping whoever or whatever it was would go away. But the knocking continued, growing louder, more violent, until it sounded like someone was trying to break the door down. I ran to the door, bracing myself against it, heart pounding, as the knocking turned into pounding, the wood splintering under the force. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stayed by the door all night, too afraid to move. When morning finally came, I went to Mrs. Hopkins, demanding answers. She looked at me with something close to pity, and told me about the village's history, about how it had been founded by people seeking refuge from something dark, something they brought with them from the old country. "They're still here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The Watchers. They protect us, but they don't like outsiders." I wanted to leave that instant, but I knew I was trapped. The nearest town was miles away, and I had no transportation, no way to contact anyone. My only option was to wait and hope that somehow I'd make it out. The final night was the worst. The footsteps returned, louder than ever, accompanied by whispers, scratching, the sounds of things moving outside my window. I sat in the corner of my room, candle flickering, praying for it to end, and then, just as the first light of dawn broke, the noises stopped. I packed my things, determined to leave, even if I had to walk daughter as I stepped out of the house. I looked back at Kilburn Hollow one last time. The village was empty, eerily silent, the shadows long and dark. I could feel the Watchers' eyes on me, could feel their hatred, their hunger. I didn't stop walking until I reached the main road, my heart racing, my mind reeling. I never looked back, daughter. As I finally reached the main road, I stopped to catch my breath. My heart was still pounding, every nerve on edge, but for the first time in days, I felt a strange sense of relief. The village of Kilburn Hollow was miles behind me, and with every step I took, I could feel the weight of its oppressive presence lifting. But just as I thought I was safe, something caught my eye on the side of the road. There was a small wooden sign I hadn't noticed when I first arrived. It was so old and faded that I could barely make out the words, but when I squinted, I felt a chill run down my spine. "Welcome to Kilburn Hollow. Visitors not advised." It was like the final piece of a nightmare puzzle, a warning hidden in plain sight that I'd missed on my way in. I should have known from the beginning that something was wrong with that place, but it was too late for regrets. All I could do now was keep walking, put as much distance between myself and that village as possible, and hope I'd never have to look back. But as I started walking again, I felt this strange sensation, like I was being watched. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that I was just paranoid after everything I'd been through. But the feeling only grew stronger with each step, until it felt like a pair of invisible eyes were fixed on me, following my every move. I forced myself not to look back, my mind racing. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I was out of the village now, on my way to safety. Whatever haunted Kilburn Hollow had no power here. Right. That's what I told myself. But then I noticed the shadows stretching across the road, twisting and curling like fingers reaching out to me. The sun was high in the sky, but the shadows were thick and dark, as if something was hiding within them, watching, waiting. I quickened my pace, practically jogging now, desperate to escape the invisible gaze that seemed to follow me. I didn't know how far I walked or how long I'd been out there, but eventually I saw a car coming down the road in the distance. Relief washed over me. I waved frantically, hoping the driver would stop and give me a ride back to civilization. The car slowed down, and a middle-aged man rolled down the window, looking at me with a mixture of confusion and concern. "You all right, miss?" he asked, eyeing me warily. I just need to get out of here," I stammered, my voice trembling. Can you take me to the nearest town? He nodded, unlocking the door. I climbed into the passenger seat, feeling a rush of gratitude and relief. I didn't even care where he was headed, as long as it was away from Kilburn Hollow. That was all that mattered. As we drove, I tried to calm myself, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see the dark figure from the village standing by the roadside, watching us, but there was nothing, just endless trees and shadows stretching out into the distance. We drove in silence for a while before the man finally spoke. You came from Kilburn Hollow, didn't you? He asked, his tone low and wary. I hesitated, not sure how to respond, but something in his voice told me he already knew the answer. Yeah, I said, my voice barely a whisper. How did you know? He let out a long sigh, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. Not many people come from that place, he murmured, and those who do, well, they never seem quite the same. A cold chill ran down my spine, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I didn't want to ask, but I had to know. What do you mean? I asked, my voice trembling. He glanced at me, his eyes dark and serious. Kilburn Hollow's been cursed for generations. They say the villagers made a deal with something. Something dark. They think it protects them, but it demands a price. Anyone who comes to that place, anyone who doesn't belong, well, they become part of the bargain. I felt my stomach twist with dread. Was that what had been watching me? What had been following me? We drove in silence for the rest of the journey. Eventually, we reached a small town, and the man dropped me off at a bus station. I thanked him, but he just nodded, his face pale and distant, as if he didn't want to dwell on what he knew about Kilburn Hollow. As I boarded the bus back to the city, I thought I'd finally escaped the nightmare, but over the next few days, strange things began to happen. At night, I'd hear faint whispers outside my apartment door. Like the voices I'd heard in Kilburn Hollow, I'd catch glimpses of shadows moving in the corner of my eye, dark shapes that vanished the moment I tried to focus on them. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, more insistent, until it was almost unbearable. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything but the sense of dread that hung over me like a dark cloud. One night, as I lay in bed, paralyzed by fear, I heard the sound of footsteps outside my window, slow, deliberate, the same footsteps I'd heard pacing around the house in Kilburn Hollow. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. I just lay there, waiting, as the footsteps circled my apartment, growing louder, closer, and then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. The silence was suffocating, thick with the presence of something unseen. The next morning, I found something scratched into my front door, 4 words carved deep into the wood. You belong to us. After finding those words scratched into my door, my life changed. Sleep became a distant memory. My every waking moment was spent in a state of heightened dread. I tried everything to shake the feeling that something or someone was with me. But no matter how many lights I left on or doors I locked, the darkness from Kilburn Hollow seemed to follow me everywhere. Days blurred into each other. The whispers grew louder, shadows more visible, footsteps more distinct. The words, "You belong to us," echoed in my mind constantly, a reminder that I might never truly escape. People at work noticed my change, the paranoia in my eyes, the gaunt look of someone who hadn't slept in days. I even tried explaining it to a friend once, but as the words left my mouth, I realized how insane it sounded. Who would believe that a village could curse someone just for stepping foot in it? One evening, exhausted and desperate, I tried to retrace my steps online, searching for any mention of Kilburn Hollow. I pored over every detail, every obscure link or mention I could find. Finally, I stumbled upon an old article buried in an online forum, titled "The Cursed Villages of the Hollowed North." I clicked on it, my heart racing. The article described Kilburn Hollow as one of the forgotten settlements, a place abandoned by time. It spoke of villagers who had made a pact centuries ago to protect themselves from war, famine, and disease, but in exchange, they promised the spirits of the Hollow something that could only be described as human tethering, linking outsiders to the village forever. Those who stumbled into Kilburn Hollow by accident were considered intruders and became bound to the village. The villagers themselves were cursed to remain there, forever isolated, unable to leave. It was as if the village existed in its own pocket of reality, and anyone who entered was claimed by the Hollow spirits. I felt my blood run cold. I didn't want to believe it, but everything I'd experienced since I left Kilburn Hollow made terrifying sense in light of what I was reading. Every sighting, every whisper, every shadow was a reminder that I was no longer truly free. I kept reading, my heart pounding, until I reached the last section of the article. It described the marked those who tried to escape the hollow, but were eventually dragged back. The villagers, or rather, their spirits, would return for them, reclaiming what was theirs. The final sentence sent chills down my spine. Those who belonged to the hollow always return to the hollow. I shut my laptop, my hands trembling. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by my front door, clutching a flashlight, waiting for the footsteps, the whispers, anything that would signal that the hollow had come for me. Days passed. I tried to go about my life as usual, but the sensation of being watched was constant. I never truly felt alone, even in the middle of the day. Every time I passed a reflective surface, I swore I saw faint figures in the background, distorted shapes watching me from the shadows. The final straw came one night when I woke to the sound of my own voice whispering in the darkness. Only, it wasn't me. The voice was faint, coming from the corner of my room, chanting in a language I didn't recognize. I froze, paralyzed by fear, as the voice grew louder, echoing of the walls, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my bags, bought a ticket to the other side of the country, and left that night, hoping distance would sever whatever tie the hollow had on me. But the moment I stepped into my new apartment, I saw them scratches on the wall, faint but unmistakable. You belong to us. No matter where I go, I know the hollow will find me. It's a curse, a tether that can't be broken, and now, every time I close my eyes, I see the village's twisted streets, its empty windows, its silent figure standing in the shadows, waiting. I understand now that there's no escape. The hollow doesn't need walls or borders. It's not confined to any one place. Kilburn Hollow is wherever I am, wherever it decides to follow me. I can't run, and I can't hide. And if you're reading this, let my story be a warning. There are places in this world that aren't meant to be found. Places that claim you the moment you set foot in them. If you ever find yourself on an unmarked road, with ancient trees whispering in the wind, turn back. No matter how curious you are, no matter how much you want to explore, turn back. Because once the hollow has you, it never lets go. Thank you for watching this story. If it left you unsettled, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with anyone who loves a good scare. Do you have a terrifying story of your own? Drop it in the comments, or send it and you might just see it featured here. And remember, sometimes, the only way out is never to enter at all. Stay curious, stay cautious, and we'll see you in the next nightmare. Like, comment, subscribe.